This is a demonstration on how the single heart tube transforms to become the four-chamber heart. By day 19, two endocardial tubes form from the mesoderm. These two tubes will fuse to form one single primitive heart tube. This process is called lateral folding. In this process, the two tubes come together and they form the aortic sac, which will become the aortic arches. They form the bulbus cordis, the primitive ventricle, the primitive atria, and the sinus venosus. Okay, so in order to clearly see the separate parts of the primitive heart tube, they are displayed here in different colors, with the sinus venosus at the bottom in blue, which will become the right part of the right atrium, the SVC, vitelline veins, cardinal veins, and umbilical vein. Above that, we see this yellow A is our primitive atria, which will form parts of the right and left atria. And moving superiorly, we have the primitive ventricle, which forms most of the left ventricle. And above that, we have the bulbus cordis, which is split into three different sections, which are going to make up different portions of the heart. The distal portion here is going to be responsible for making the primitive right ventricle, while the second third is going to be responsible for making the outflow tracts, and the top third will be responsible for making the ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. The next step in the process is cardiac looping, which the heart begins to beat at day 22, and at day 23, the heart tube begins to loop. In order to make this looping happen, the bulbus cordis comes toward the right of the embryo, which we can see here, toward the right of the embryo and inferiorly to make a C shape. Then the primitive ventricle moves toward the left, and then making this S shape before the primitive atrium moves inferior and posteriorly behind the bulbus cordis, so now we have the primitive atria at the more cranial portion, the primitive ventricle more caudally, and then the bulbus cordis more anteriorly coming out from the primitive ventricle. Okay, so the next step is going to be dividing the heart into the four chambers. The first part of that is going to be the endocardial cushions. We'll start to separate the primary atria from the primary ventricles. And at this point, we still have a single orifice from the atria to the ventricles. Then the atria are going to separate into two separate atria. That happens when the septum primum starts to grow down from the top portion of the atria and starts to grow. And at this point, we have an opening before the septum primum completely reaches the endocardial cushion. We have an opening here, which is our ostium primum. Before the ostium primum completely closes, the ostium secundum starts to form more superiorly. So the ostium secundum forms before the ostium primum completely closes. The ostium primum does eventually completely close, And the next step is that the septum secundum starts to grow down from the top as well. This is a much thicker piece of tissue compared to the septum primum, and it doesn't completely close at this portion, so we have an opening that stays open to be the foramen ovale. So that grows down next to the septum primum, and as that grows down, the septum primum starts to regress. And as the septum primum regresses, so the septum secundum does completely close that ostium secundum. And as the septum primum regresses, it becomes smaller and more like a small flap, which now we see is the foramen ovale flap. So as the blood moves into the right atrium through the foramen ovale, it pushes the remnant of the septum primum into the left atrium, and we see that as the flap of the foramen ovale flap. So the septum secundum forms the foramen ovale, and the septum primum remnant becomes the foramen ovale flap. Okay, so now at this point, the heart is going to start to form two separate orifices between the atria and the ventricles. The endocardial cushion is going to form those two separate orifices, and it's also going to form the valve leaflets. So the tricuspid valve leaflet, so we have this is our right side and this is our left side. Our tricuspid valve leaflet on the right side is going to form slightly more apical than our mitral valve leaflet. So we have our two separate orifices with our tricuspid valve inserting into this portion, more apical than our mitral valve, which sits more in line, closer up toward the atria. The next part is going to be the ventricles will start to divide, and that happens, the muscular portion of the septum starts to grow up from the bottom, and it never completely reaches the endocardial cushion because this last portion of the septum, this perimembranous portion of the septum, is going to be formed by the conotruncal division. The next step is to divide the two outflow tracts. So if we take a cut here, looking back at our primitive folded heart tube, if we cut here, then we will open that tube and see how the septum is forming within that tube. Here, we have a spiral septum that forms because we have our right bulbar ridges connecting with our left truncal ridges and our left bulbar ridges connecting with our right truncal ridges, which cause the septum to form in this spiral shape. Then the two vessels divide around this spiral septum, so the aorta is going to form starting from the left and coming on the side of the septum, staying on that side of the septum, ending on the right. And the pulmonary is going to form starting on the right and coming across anteriorly to the aorta on the other side of that septum in a spiral pattern. Next, we're going to look at the relationship of the vessels. So here inferiorly, you can see that the aorta, if we're looking at this as if we're looking at a clock, aorta sits at 6 o'clock, pulmonary sits at 12 o'clock. Then if you come to the middle, we have the aorta at 9 o'clock and the pulmonary at 3 o'clock. And then up at the top, we have the aorta. If we cut here at the top, we have the aorta at 12 o'clock and the pulmonary now at 6 o'clock. So they do a full spiral around each other. Now the last step is to finish the division of the ventricular septum so that the left and right are completely separate from each other. That happens by the aorticopulmonary septum is what's going to actually extend and form the perimembranous portion of the ventricular septum, with the aorta on the left, coming from the left atrium, and the pulmonary on the right, coming from the right atrium, and the division of the ventricles is complete. So our finished product is now a 4-chamber heart with complete division of the ventricles, and you have your aorta coming from the left and your pulmonary coming from the right. They crisscross just at the level of the septum, and you can see a little bit more superiorly that we have the aorta sitting more to the right and the pulmonary sitting more to the left. The pulmonary then branches into the right and left pulmonary branches, and the aortic arch comes back to the left as it makes an arch to the descending aorta.